So it was this huge hope somehow, maybe then a change is coming super fast.
Even when we had these huge strikes with hundreds of thousands of people in different cities, the politics didn't change.
What are you going to do if they don't respond?
For us, the strategy isn't then necessarily getting people to believe that the climate crisis exists. It's more like, how does the climate crisis connect to the income inequality that we see in Singapore? That also is quite directly a threat then to the states, right? They don't necessarily want us to be like united, right? They would rather us sort of see these things as like single issues.
So with us today is Kristian. He is a climate activist from Singapore and one of the founders of Singapore Climate Rally. Before we start, my name is Elias König, and the interview that you're listening to is part of a whole series of interviews I conducted for a research project at Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. In these interviews, I ask many amazing activists and researchers from different communities what it means for them to strike for climate justice and to share their thoughts on the future of the movement. I learned so much from these conversations, and I hope that they can be valuable to you too. If you have any thoughts, please do not hesitate to comment here or to get in touch directly. But now, without further ado, here's the episode.
So, hi, my name is Kristian. I was one of the founding members of SG Climate Rally back in Singapore in 2019. And just for a bit of context, SG Climate Rally was started when a few people were thinking about putting together a physical rally in Singapore around the climate crisis. So for context, in Singapore, you can't protest. There is a designated space that you can hold rallies in, subject to permits getting approved. So you have to apply for a permit. If it gets approved, then you can protest in this designated space. On top of that, it's only Singaporean citizens and Singaporean permanent residents that can enter this space during a rally or a protest or a demonstration. So before I think 2019, there were no physical rallies mobilized around the climate crisis. I think there were digital strikes. And small ad hoc events here and there, but there wasn't necessarily a big large scale physical demonstration. Beyond that, also, I think a few people recognized and were aware of, I think just I think the discourse, or rather I think the lack of structural action being articulated within environmental discourse in Singapore. So a lot of it was about reducing plastic, using don't use your bubble, don't use plastic straw for your bubble tea, right? Buy a metal straw and things like that. As opposed to actually thinking about, okay, well, actually carbon emissions in Singapore, almost half of carbon emissions comes from industry. We are quite Singapore is a petrochemical hub. We've got I think some of the largest oil refineries and things like that. So turning off your lights or showering less, it's not really going to do much. I mean, sure, those things are important, but we need to be thinking about who the biggest stakeholders are. So with all that, people decided, okay, let's have a rally where we can articulate, I think, these things a bit more and put that out there into existence. So because of that, actually Climate Rally was born, and I came to know about it through a few friends. I think at this point in time, it was really just people going around asking through their personal networks whether or not they knew people who were interested. And admittedly, at this point, I had just graduated from college, and also admittedly was not incredibly well versed in environmentalism or just environmental discourse. I think they were things that I obviously knew about and felt very strongly about, but I guess a lot of the activism that I did in school prior to joining SG Climate Rally was around things like gender justice, looking at, more like robust sexual misconduct policies, thinking about kind of like administration within the university space and things like that. So I wasn't necessarily involved in, for example, sort of like environmental groups in university. But I think what helped me was that I did anthropology as my undergrad degree, and I guess majoring in anthropology specifically also, I think, really helped me understand sort of like the structural and interconnected implications with all the different like injustices and oppressions around the world. And so that obviously then made me very cognizant of how the climate crisis is indeed not a phenomenon that like exists independent of all these other things. And so that also then made me, I think, a lot more ready also then to just to like mobilize around the climate crisis, mobilize around like climate justice. I think also, given that like I identify as a feminist, I don't know if I can say, I mean, I don't know if it's safe for me to say that I identify as like a Marxist feminist, but that's it. That's what I identify as. I think that also allowed me to, I think, maybe more readily than some people sort of see the explicit interconnections between the climate crisis and other like injustices, and sort of the material impacts of it, which then made me, I think, very energized to join this group that was trying to organize a rally. The last thing I would say is that I think beyond that also, I think I come from like, I think my parents also have been like very explicitly, like I think political, or I think from a young age, given also I think my lived experiences of being like a minority race individual in Singapore, and also coming from, at least when I was growing up, quite a financially precarious background. I think that to me was reflected through my parents and articulated through my parents, that like these things are all connected, or rather like, there is, it's not like, I guess it's not necessarily individual failings that we are in this situation. There are bigger forces. And though obviously, I think before university, I didn't necessarily have the language to articulate those things, I think that feeling was really, was there. And I think from a young age, really wanted to like, just try and do things, or, just like call out injustices. And so that I think made me also then predisposed to activism more broadly. And then, I think ultimately also made me a lot more inclined to just sort of like, sign up to help organize the rally.
Yeah, Kristian, you mentioned that 2019 was really a key moment in the climate movement in Singapore, with the founding of Singapore Climate Rally. And I think it was in many places globally. And in 2019, you also had the first global climate strikes, which were youth-led. So I'm wondering, how did also the movement in Singapore relate to these other protests? Did it see itself as part of those? How maybe even were there attempts to coordinate actions together? And yeah, how did the movement develop from then onwards? What maybe changed in the last few years as well with the coronavirus pandemic?
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a good question. I think strategically we were quite deliberate about sort of where we placed ourselves in relation to like the larger ecosystem of like climate activism, sort of like within sort of like, the larger ecosystem of all the different like strikes that were happening. And we did indeed have the actual rally, I think like sort of like a few days before the actual sort of global climate strikes. So sort of like, it was definitely placed within sort of like the same few weeks. So we were, I think, I think we didn't shy away from saying that we are holding this rally because other people are holding the rally around the same time. But at the same time, we were quite, I think, deliberate and intentional with saying that it was a rally instead of like a strike, which is definitely something that we thought long and hard about. I think just because sort of like the history of like activism, the history of just like surveillance, I guess, in Singapore, and the sort of curtailing of like people power, the curtailing of like activism, advocacy. I think something like a strike has a very specific connotation, which even though may not necessarily in and of itself sort of carry a value judgment, I think in Singapore very immediately reads as like antagonistic, anti-establishment, inflammatory. And even though some of those things may be true, I think we didn't necessarily want that to sort of be like the immediate thing that people picked up from the rally, which is why then we went with rally. And I guess also beyond that, I think it helped also sort of like maybe localize it a bit more, and I think people did appreciate it. It also helped that I guess with like calling it a rally, it did make it seem maybe a bit more accessible also, which is also then something that we were quite intentional with articulating and expressing during like interviews, during like our press releases and things like that, that a rally is sort of just almost like an event where people can come together and just sort of be with one another, where there isn't necessarily like an explicit like where there isn't necessarily sort of like it's not necessary for like agitation per se. It is really just for us to come together to collectively acknowledge that we can be doing more to combat the crisis, which then means also then families could feel more welcome in space, people of different ages could be more welcome in that space, people who don't identify as activists could be welcome in that space. And so we that, which is why then we also went with SG Climate Rally. I think it being youth-led also definitely helped, and that's definitely something that we still, I mean, we are a youth-led movement for sure, and we were also quite intentional with playing that up in that, like, which I think is also something that a lot of people do sort of like across the globe, right? Like there is definitely, I think, clout or value in, just demonstrating that young people actually have strong beliefs and strong thoughts on what should be done. And so that's definitely something that I think we were very deliberate about, which also helped. I think it helped with like state administrators also feeling a lot more like, or at least I think kind of like displaying compassion a bit more readily than they would towards maybe like kind of like older activists or I think definitely going to then your question about evolution. Okay, maybe I won't. Okay, let me. Okay, yeah, I think in terms of like the movement and how it's evolved, I mean, I don't think sort of like the deeper kind of like politics or the deeper sort of vision of SG Climate Rally being a movement that stands for structural action, that has not changed for sure. But I think what has sort of evolved within the movement is sort of like our focus on climate justice, environmental justice. That wasn't necessarily, I think, really as explicit or even present, I think, within the first rally, and even within like sort of any kind of like publicity material that we were putting out in 2019. But that's definitely something that we've sort of introduced and folded into our narratives and in our publicity, our social media, and et cetera, into our theory of change also. Right, the idea that there are indeed going to be some people who are already feeling the crisis or experiencing the crisis in much more like material ways. And even if that's not immediately visible in a place like Singapore, because I think the climate crisis, we do experience a climate crisis in fairly unique way, maybe as compared to especially like a lot of our other regional neighbors, there are still indeed like differentiated and unequal impacts. And that also means that we have to take that into account. And I think beyond that, also something that is very important is for us to zoom out a bit more and to say that if we are thinking about climate justice or environmental justice, then we have to think about the other systems that reinforce and perpetuate the climate crisis, right? Like, how do we even get here? How, what has enabled this to happen? There are indeed other systems that encourage that, that incentivize us to keep extracting from our planet. And so those things have definitely become a lot more explicit within like our messaging, which wasn't necessarily that, as present in 2019. I think for COVID, it's definitely been tough, and I guess it's very tricky in that, like, I guess we've had a lot of conversations about like what mobilizing can look like, and it really got us to think about also, are we indeed privileging sort of like physical interaction? Something like a rally is indeed, even though it is maybe like effective, there is something I think quite powerful, important about bodies in a space, but also, I guess then the question becomes, is that in and of itself also accessible to like everyone? And so I think that was definitely a question that really came, really like sort of like, became a question that we kept asking ourselves during COVID. I think sort of where we landed was that, number one, it is just, I think, still a bit ideal for sure to have like a physical demonstration. I think there is something very, very powerful about just seeing like thousands of people gathered in a space, right? I think that is such a like visual, it's such a visual symbol of like, oh shit, there are all these people who actually feel the same way, as opposed to just like, a few like sort of like thumbnails on Zoom or whatever. But I think we did try to be like quite creative with then how do we also engage online? How do we still kind of get different people to show up if we were to do like a digital rally, especially once like Zoom fatigue really like hit. Something that we tried to do was, so we had sort of like an online rally, I think last year, so this is 2021, and something that we tried to do were there ways in which we could like almost kind of like mobilize like hubs or pods of people within specific areas? So like, can we like, because at that point of time you could have like 5 guests over at your house in Singapore, and so could we just like get people to like organize like almost kind of like viewing parties, right, and ensure that you have all these different sort of like pods existing and popping up sort of across Singapore, or also like if we are thinking of like low income households who may not necessarily have access to like technology or like to a good working like laptop and good Wi-Fi and things like that, how can we provide that for them? How can we like screen maybe the rally where people can come, to like the recreational center or something to watch, which are things that we definitely, I think, tried to do, just so that we could still get, I think, a lot of people involved. So I guess there was still sort of a mixture of like, even though it's going to be online, is there any way we could still sort of like, I guess, encourage some physical contact, encourage people to like self-organize and like host screenings, just so that, I guess, even though it was decentralized, you still sort of had kind of like a collective mobilization, I suppose.
Thank you. That is very interesting, and I'd like to pick up on your point about climate justice and social justice issues becoming, I guess, more and more prominent within the discourse, within the movement. And I think that's something that you can also observe globally. For instance, with groups that identify as Fridays for Future, MAPA, most affected people in areas, taking a much more leading role within the global movement. So I'm wondering, these reflections, these theoretical reflections, I think a lot of them were also sparked maybe by the debates that were had during the COVID pandemic about inequality, and also perhaps the Black Lives Matter movement, at least in parts of the world. How would you see these debates translate into another kind of praxis, perhaps, now that many countries are sort of coming out of the pandemic. And I'd be interested in Singapore specifically. How do you think these debates may also affect your praxis as a movement now that your country is also opening up again?
Yeah. No, I think something that I was very surprised by, or like pleasantly surprised by, when I first came to London and I attended what was it that I attended? It was I guess I think the global day of climate justice, I think. And there was quite a fairly big at least big for me, I guess, given that I come from Singapore, but a fairly big demonstration in Trafalgar Square in central London. And just listening to the speeches, I was I was surprised, because I think there was a lot of linkages being made to other injustices. So specifically racial injustice, specifically on just class or wealth inequality more broadly, job precarity. So, and what they did was they also then had, I guess, sort of just other organizers, but also other workers speaking, right? So you not only had environmental activists, but you had, for example, I remember an activist who works in a predominantly Black neighborhood in I think East London, where they are adversely affected by I think refining, or can't remember what it was, but there was because it is sort of an industrial area, obviously then the people who live there are people also from working class backgrounds, from financially precarious backgrounds, who are then also predominantly Black or brown, and how then the climate crisis, there is such a direct effect, right? The people who are actually directly being affected by the smog and the fumes coming out from the industries literally just affects the children in that space, or people who are more vulnerable to different health issues and things like that. And then they also, for example, had a nurse speak, and how as as at least I guess as nursing or just care work becomes more and more precarious, becomes so much more informal. The healthcare system cannot cope then with all the people who are coming in, with sort of diseases or just illnesses related to the climate crisis. Obviously, you had COVID-19, right? And there's so much literature on how kind of our, humans and sort of our encroaching into natural spaces obviously has affected something like COVID-19. And so the nurse was saying that if we see the climate crisis as a public health crisis, that makes no sense that you then have such precarious labor, right? And so I guess for me, it was interesting to sort of see so explicitly, I guess, the climate crisis sort of I don't know, evolve or expand to, to include, I guess, people that you won't necessarily think of as environmental activists. And I think a fair critique that has been made of the environmental movement, at least historically, is that it is definitely made of people who are predominantly from very privileged identities, right? People who, maybe are usually white, or come from upper middle class backgrounds, people who are a bit more financially stable, people who have the opportunity to actually just sort of spend time going in the streets, as opposed to having to worry about juggling 3 jobs or whatever. So I think this strike, or this demonstration, I think to me was I guess encouraging, at least from where I came. I mean, in Singapore, that's obviously not to kind of valorize, kind of obviously there are still a lot of things that can be done, and a lot of critiques that I think that can still be made, and critiques that I also still have of the movement more broadly. But I think then thinking about, I guess, then my place in Singapore and kind of what we can do in Singapore, really got me thinking about how we can, I think, try and be more, just like holistic, I suppose, with the kind of faces also that we spotlight or highlight during rallies or things like that, which, to be fair, I think we also sort of did already start doing. So last year with our digital climate rally, we had a mother who comes from like a low income household, so sort of like kind of like your social housing equivalent in Singapore, speak about how Singapore is indeed getting so much hotter, and as you know, people who don't have the money and the luxury to afford like air conditioning, for example, it's just so incredibly hot. The space is small, the space is cramped. It doesn't help. We also had like migrant workers speak about how they are most exposed to like heat injuries because they toil, they do physical labor in the sun all day, and they don't have the sort of bargaining power to ask for better protections. Then we also had like a petchem worker actually come and speak about, like, I think the head of like the petchem union come to speak about how there are indeed a lot of petchem workers who are thinking about like the transition, who are thinking about how are our governments going to protect us when we do inevitably need to transition away. So I think, and I think that just is so educational, because for like two reasons, right? I guess like number one, even within the environmental movement, and I think in Singapore specifically, I think there is sort of like a lot of focus on sort of like technological fixes, right? Sort of like your environmental tech, or like environmental, like green finance, and that sort of like, I think a lot of the language or the solutions that are provided. And so I think a lot of like the environmental movement also then provide solutions that sort of fit within those like frameworks. And so I think having all these diverse speakers speak is number one, educational for the environmental movement itself in Singapore, to be like, okay, actually maybe we should just be thinking a bit more about like just like human rights, labor rights, which are like, I think a bit more material and less like technical also than like green finance and like agri-tech and things like that. But beyond that also, it helps us kind of just like expand the imagination, right? In a space like Singapore, especially, I guess I personally always think about like the Overton window, right? The whole like idea that at any one point of time there are like discourses or discussions that seem plausible and that sort of can expand or can shift depending on the kinds of things that people are talking about. So how can we as activists sort of expand those discourses that are indeed possible? Can we start not only talking about environmental technology, but can we also talk about like minimum wage, or how minimum wage can like, actually be beneficial for like combating this crisis? And that those conversations only become possible if people sort of speak that into existence. So then our role as a movement also becomes, can we be those people that like talk about these things, and hopefully that helps to galvanize other people to talk about it and eventually makes it seem actually like a plausible policy to put in place. I think I'll stop there first.
Yes, thanks. I mean, you've raised a lot of programmatic points, and also you talked about the inclusion of different new actors into a movement that started quite explicitly as a youth movement, but now seems to have branched out and taken up these other struggles as well. So I find it very curious. Perhaps as a last question, I would like to ask you, I mean, another critique of the movement has also been that it has been, by its own standards, rather ineffective so far. I mean, when you look at the global carbon emissions around the world, but also in Singapore, there has been not the kind of turn that everyone has hoped for, at least so far. So in thinking about how the movement can become both more inclusive and more intersectional and more successful, how do you think that could happen, and how do you see the role of the climate rally or the climate strike in that. Yeah, how would a successful and intersectional climate rally of the future look like?
Yeah, I mean, I guess yeah, I'll answer this question like kind of like at least from the from like sort of like my point of view of being just like placed in Singapore, I guess I'm living there. Yeah, I think at least for Singapore, we are in a strategic, or at least we're in sort of like interesting and I guess slightly privileged position where like something like climate denialism does not really exist. Like I think our government and people in general understand that the climate crisis like happens, like so we don't actually have sort of like companies or like policymakers outright explicitly coming out and being like, oh, it's not really a problem, which is like a whole different beast that we don't necessarily have to like sort of like tackle. So I think then that helps with already sort of like the, I guess kind of like the starting point for us is a little, I guess slightly easier, but like I guess because everyone sort of acknowledges that the climate crisis is indeed something that affects all of us, that also I think presents us with an opportunity to use the climate crisis as a way to like unite the different movements, which I think definitely also like I think is something that can like that does sort of exist globally, but at the same time I think there are obviously like different like parts of the broader movement that still sort of see it as quite independent from like other justice movements or other like activists, other activist movements and things like that. But I think at least in Singapore, what we've tried to do is to really think about how the environmental movement in Singapore can be more embedded within like, just broader civil society. How can we start to make the connections for people? Because I guess for us, the strategy isn't then necessarily getting people to believe that the climate crisis exists. It's more like, how does the climate crisis connect to the income inequality that we see in Singapore? And I think it's been, and I guess that the strategy then is also to see how we can really, just like build stronger partnerships and networks with other like activist civil society movements within Singapore. I mean, I think that also is quite directly a threat then to the states, right? They don't necessarily want us to be like united, right? They would rather us sort of see these things as like single issues. And I think, I mean, I can go like, it's a whole different conversation about how like, I think Singapore is sort of like infrastructurally and sort of just like structurally constructed in a way where like things are very individualized, or like issues also then are sort of like very depoliticized and like abstracted and sort of exist independent of each other. And so I think sort of like the climate movement has an opportunity to sort of like, I think, really challenge that, because I guess the climate crisis, as opposed to sort of like other issues like racism in Singapore, where like there is still so much contest about whether or not it exists. Whereas like in comparison, the climate crisis is something that like everyone sort of like generally acknowledges. It's already then like, I guess at least we're one step ahead with then being like, okay, now we can really try and like mobilize different people. I think it is also then to our benefit, because a critique that I guess happens a lot in Singapore is that like the environmental movement, but also just like more broadly, right, that only a specific class of people are interested in environmentalism, which is indeed not true. And so then how, can we show that like actually us as environmental activists also care about income inequality in Singapore, also care about protecting our pet chem workers when they do need to like, when their jobs are phased out. Which also then I think leads to like the second strategy that we have been thinking about, is how can we just build stronger regional bonds, especially thinking that we're in like Southeast Asia, which is I think like, it's been made quite clear that like Asia, but also like Southeast Asia is going to be like hit very, very badly by the climate crisis. I mean, it already has, but it's just going to get worse. So then I guess kind of like, how do we position ourselves as number one, a country that is like incredibly like capitalist, but also just like that has benefited so much at the expense of our regional neighbors. That shouldn't necessarily, I mean, that it is a global North country in amongst like other, like global South countries. How do we reckon with our complicity, but at the same time, then how do we ensure that we show that we are indeed standing in solidarity? I think another threat that could be potentially very effective, or rather, sorry, another like perceived threat from like the government's point of view would be like a regional coalition. I think that is strong, that it is also one that is centered on like social justice and kind of like maybe like anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, apart from obviously being environmental, I think is a very scary notion for like the people in power. And if we can indeed get, I guess Singaporeans on like our side to stand in solidarity and stand alongside like our regional neighbors, I think that could be very powerful, because something that happens a lot within Singapore is that, there's just a lot of like sort of like moralizing like reasonings that are put out for why, for example, the carbon tax cannot be higher in Singapore. Something that always, like, I think the government always says is that like, oh, if the carbon tax were higher, then like all these like companies would go to like other Southeast Asian like countries where they don't necessarily care as much. So I think there is sort of like this kind of like moralizing argument that actually, if you stay within Singapore, even if we're not doing enough, we're sort of protecting these people. And so I think it's which I think is very much built on sort of like existing hierarchy as to kind of where Singapore is placed already. So how can we combat that? How can we ensure that so if your everyday Singaporean sort of sees that line of reasoning as problematic? Because once that happens and once we can convince them, then I think we do stand like, I think, quite a big chance of like winning, I guess. So something that we've been trying also then is thinking about how do we build stronger ties? How do we ensure that we understand very intimately our complicity, but also the issues? How can we speak very readily to like issues that are happening? How are we like cognizant also of just sort of like where we are in the region? I think there is a lot of like, there's not a lot of like knowledge. I think there is a lot of ignorance as to kind of what's happening with our neighbors. And so, that also means we have to really like educate ourselves. So those I think are sort of like the two main strategies that like, at least SG Climate Rally, I think, has been thinking of.
So a call for international solidarity and a call for building more broad coalitions. I think
internationalism, man. Yeah.
That's a nice note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us, Kristian.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
And thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the interview. Feel free to check out the other episodes as well. And I hope you have a great day wherever you are.